Before I introduce our next panel, I'd like to welcome four more of our conference supporters who are here with us at online, if you can't, even though you can't see them. Jennifer Thornton with the Business Roundtable, Natalie Labella at the American Apparel and Footwear Association, Scott Jacobs and Jason Park with Coupang, and John Gold with the National Retail Federation. Also like to shout out Allison McKitchen with the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center, who's our host for the in-person sessions tomorrow. Welcome, Jennifer, Natalie, Scott, Jason, John, Allison, and thanks to BRT, AAFA, Coupang, NRF, and the World Trade Center for your support. With that, I'd like to invite on camera our next panel to please turn on their camera. This year, one of the areas we expect to see a lot of discussion in global trade circles is on digital trade and technology issues. We're pleased to partner with our friends at the National Foreign Trade Council on a series of events to discuss global digital trade, starting with today's panel on renewing U.S. global leadership on technology and trade. Thank you to our friend and event partner, Jake Colvin, the president of the National Foreign Trade Council, who will be moderating our discussion today. Welcome back to the WITA Zoom webinar room, Ambassador Tan Heng Seng, with a permanent representative of Singapore mission to the WTO and one of the co-conveners of the WTO's Joint Statement Initiative on E-commerce. Jason Oxman, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Information Technology Industry Council. Kate Kalutkiewicz, Senior Managing Director at McLarty Associates and a former Special Assistant to President Trump on the National Economic Council. And Olivia Walch, CEO of Arcascope, who is a new participant in WITA webinars. Pleasure to have you on, Olivia. Thank you all for joining us. Jake?
Ken, thanks very much. And thanks to you, Diego, Maya, and everyone at WITA for making space for this conversation on digital trade. Like you said, we're excited to partner with you on the broader series coming forward. I think as Everett's panel suggested, it's sort of challenging to find time to talk about anything else besides tariffs at the moment. And so, really appreciate the chance to talk about U.S. global economic leadership in the digital space. I think there are some reasons to be enthusiastic about the future of digital trade leadership in the United States. During the first Trump administration, the president and Congress worked together to write new digital trade rules in USMCA. And I was at the WTO ministerial in Buenos Aires, where Ambassador Lighthizer helped lead the launch of new e-commerce discussions, which USTR then helped to advance, working with Singapore and Japan and Australia and others. We all know what happened since then, as the last administration stepped away from taking a global leadership role on digital trade. Those new digital trade rules under IPEF failed to materialize, and USTR affirmatively withdrew its leadership role at the World Trade Organization in those e-commerce discussions, which led other countries to move ahead without us. That brings us to today where I think we're at an inflection point. And so we can either sort of shape the global digital ecosystem or be shaped by it. Because if we're not writing new digital and AI rules and standing up for our companies and workers abroad, then we're going to have to live with whatever the rest of the world writes in terms of new rules and policies. I think we've already seen some positive signs by the new administration. USTR designate Jameson Greer noted in his testimony and follow-up to the Senate Finance Committee that advancing digital trade is a key objective of U.S. trade policy, and he committed to developing a strategy that advances U.S. competitiveness and technology leadership. You saw the administration appoint David Sachs as its AI coordinator, and he's been out on the airwaves talking about the importance of U.S. global AI leadership in the wake of the launch of DeepSeek's new platform. I think it's worth pointing out that American voters overwhelmingly support stronger U.S. global leadership on technology. Late last year, the NFTC commissioned a poll for Morning Consult, where we found that more than 80% of Americans think that it's important for the U.S. To develop a digital trade agenda that helps American businesses compete. And around the same percentage think that the U.S. has taken a significant step backward in that leadership to the benefit of China. So grateful to have such a thoughtful group of speakers to help us explore the future of U.S. trade and technology leadership. You already read everyone's name, and so I'm not going to do it again. But in terms of how this is all going to work, I'm going to ask each of you an initial question. Got a couple of follow-up questions to dig deeper on things like AI and tariffs. And then we'll try to incorporate some questions from the audience. And so if you do have a question, please submit them through the Q&A function. Kate, I was going to turn to you first. So could you talk a little bit about how you think the Trump administration is going to engage on digital trade and how that might differ from the previous administration?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. And thanks to Ken and Wida for hosting this terrific conference and for inviting me to participate. Um, I agree with you, Jake, that this is a really important issue, and it's one sometimes that's lost in the news on tariffs. And we heard the last panel cover that in great detail. You know, in your intro comments, I think you explained exactly how the two administrations are different on digital trade, but let's go into that a little bit. You know, the first Trump administration, I think, elevated digital trade in the context of trade negotiations to a new point. Not only did Ambassador Lighthizer lead in the WTO on digital trade, but the Trump administration also included new chapters on digital in its update to the NAFTA, the USMCA, and also negotiated a new bilateral arrangement with Japan. Um, you know, the Biden administration, I think, in somewhat shocking ways, not only withdrew the United States from digital leadership, but really, I think, changed the game in a way that we're going to have to get out from under. And I think it's important to think about why that happened. And I think largely, you know, a number of President Biden's economic team felt that U.S. digital leadership or U.S. technological leadership was a negative thing, that this somehow undermined workers or inclusivity or democracy in a way that is somewhat surprising. You know, we saw the Biden administration not only not defend American digital companies from targeted regulation and policy actions overseas, but even sometimes in very shocking ways suggest to regulators that they ought to break up U.S. companies. This was pretty surprising, frankly, because, of course, we all know that these companies are leading drivers of the U.S. economy, and digital trade and services is one of the things that the U.S. does best. So where Trump comes into this, I think we can look not only at his first term, but also the things that he espoused in his campaign. You know, if you go back and look at the promises he made, part of it was to make the U.S. economy great again. And part of that promise is very much centered on U.S. innovation and leading the world in innovation and technology. And I think, you know, in his first couple weeks, among the flurry of executive actions that we've seen, we have seen a commitment on digital, not only in terms of, you know, addressing what he thought was regulatory overreach potentially in the spaces of AI and crypto, but also creating a new panel for advisors to the White House on tech and innovation. And I think all of these things indicate that this is going to be a priority for his administration. You know, you also focused on the fact that Jamison Greer, his nominee for USTR, and I'd also point out Howard Lutnick, the new Commerce Secretary, in their confirmation hearings, both of them were asked about digital services and digital trade. Both, I think it's fair to say, indicated that they would be working on these issues quite aggressively. And frankly, Lutnick, in a question from Senator Young, did commit to change U.S. digital trade leadership from what we saw in the Biden administration. So I think we can anticipate some fairly aggressive changes.
Thanks very much, Kate. So Jason, want to turn to you next. What does the tech community hope to see from the president and his administration on digital trade and technology leadership?
Well, thanks, Jake. Thanks for moderating a terrific panel today. And my congratulations to Ken and the WIDA team for an enormously successful event, judging by the hundreds of people that have tuned in. Trade is definitely the topic of the day, and it's great to have the opportunity to talk about it. And that's what I would say at kind of the outset for our hopes and aspirations. And Kate was talking about this as well. The fact that trade is on the mind of all policymakers and really all industries is actually a good thing. It presents us with I think, a unique opportunity with the change in administration to shift the focus from trade is a bad thing and trade is harmful to U.S. interests to trade is a very valuable tool for not only economic growth, but also for national security interests. Assuming we do it in the right way, we approach it strategically, we can use the trade portfolio of policy issues to advance, as Kate noted, all of the president's goals, from national security to economic security, from investing in manufacturing to advancing American interests around the world. So our aspiration for the Trump administration on the positive side about trade is that we've started off on a note that really gives us an opportunity to advance a positive trade agenda. So the tech industry obviously focuses very heavily on digital trade as a positive economic story. We hear a lot about trade deficits in physical goods, but of course, the trade story in digital is very different. The U.S. runs close to a $300 billion trade surplus when it comes to digital trade. That's very important. But digital trade is, of course, an ecosystem. We talk about digital trade as the kind of the abstraction of the ones and zeros that move around the world, but there's a physical infrastructure behind that. So when we talk about manufacturing in the US, for example, semiconductor manufacturing, construction of data centers, the excitement around AI, infrastructure investment in broadband and fiber and the like, all of that powers the digital services and digital products that are exported from the US. So there's a tie between the physical and the digital there that really advanced Trump administration interests. So when we talk about supporting digital trade, we're really talking about supporting trade in all goods. Now, the discussion of the day, of course, is around tariffs. And tariffs are a tool that the Trump administration has been deploying. And we would, of course, continue as we have and as we did in the Biden administration and the prior administrations to encourage the use of tariffs selectively, the use of tariffs to address market failures in international markets, the use of tariffs strategically to address national security interests, the use of tariffs as a bargaining tool, which of course have been used successfully by the Trump administration in the past, and we're seeing it used going forward. What we don't want to see is tariff policy replace trade policy. So we're looking for the use of tariffs strategically as part of an overall broader trade strategy. And to your question, Jake, about what we're looking for from the Trump administration that may be a little different from what we were looking for and seeing from the Biden administration, it really is the use of this trade policy to advance American economic interests strategically. So USMCA, as the prior panel discussed in detail, that was the gold standard for digital trade. And the chapter that was introduced into USMCA by the Trump administration is something we'd like to see replicated in future trade agreements going forward. And of course, we'd like to see the trade discussion generally focus on digital trade opportunities. We'd also like to see the discussion picked up in global bodies as well. The WTO, I was just in Geneva about 10 days ago, had a chance to meet with the Director General, as well as constituencies from Singapore and Australia and Japan that have historically been leading the WTO discussions on the e-commerce tariff moratorium, something that's been a part of the legacy of the WTO for literally decades, and the US has led on. And of course, in the digital trade arena, we saw a real move in the opposite direction during the Biden administration, away from supporting the moratorium on e-commerce tariffs, which frankly was difficult to understand. It's still difficult to understand today, even though the Biden administration is not around anymore. We need to move that in the opposite direction. We need to see the Trump administration re-engage and see the benefits to US companies of the moratorium on e-commerce tariffs that the WTO has really supported strongly for close to 3 decades. So we're looking forward to that kind of discussion taking place as well. But just to wrap up on this question of what we're looking for from the Trump administration, the digital trade portfolio is such a core component of the overall trade goals of the Trump administration to advance U.S. leadership in AI and other areas that I know we'll talk about in a minute, and also to ensure that the export opportunities for U.S. companies from the U.S. are focused not only on those all-important physical goods, but on the digital trade opportunities as well.
Thanks, Jason, and you teed up Ambassador Tan perfectly, so that's great. I mean, the one thing I just wanted to flag your point about how digital trade supports all goods, and I was down at CES in Las Vegas last month. I'm walking along the shop floor and looking at some of NFTC's members like Caterpillar and John Deere, LG, and Siemens, and the way in which the digital tools support the ecosystem and the service contracts for all the big equipment and cars that they produce. And you can't do that on a global basis and export from the United States if you don't have the right digital ecosystem in place. Ambassador Tan, really nice to see you again. Thank you very much for extending your day. I know it's a little bit later there in Geneva. Could you talk about how you hope the Trump administration will engage with Singapore and the rest of the world on digital trade issues?
Hi, Jake. Good to see you. Thank you for the question and for moderating this discussion. Then I also want to thank Ken for the invitation to participate in this conversation. Well, from the outset, let me say I don't have a crystal ball, that will enable me to share my expectations of how the Trump administration will engage on digital trade issues. But I'll be happy to share how I hope the Trump administration will do so in the WTO context. First, I hope that the Trump administration will throw its weight firmly behind the moratorium on custom duties on electronic transmissions. This is a point that Jason had raised earlier. The moratorium has been in place since the second ministerial conference in 1998, and it has played an important role in facilitating the growth of digital trade in goods and services. In particular, the moratorium has boosted digitally delivered services, which is the fastest growing segment of international trade. It expanded by almost fourfold over the last 2 decades and is estimated at 3.82 trillion US dollars in 2022. In fact, in 2022, the value of American export of services amounted to around 1 trillion US dollars, with the majority of these exports being delivered digitally. And as Jason had highlighted earlier, the US enjoy a US $300 billion surplus in digital trade. So there's very good reason for the Trump administration to put its full weight behind the moratorium. Second, I hope that the US will come on board the e-commerce agreement, which would amplify its benefits. As one of the most significant players in the e-commerce space, the US participation in the agreement will give a big boost to the harmonization of global digital trade rules. It will also encourage other countries, of course, to join the agreement and demonstrate American leadership. The US is a key economic partner for almost every country in the world, including Singapore. Hence, we hope to engage the US and hope to be able to persuade the Trump administration to come on board the e-commerce agreement. Third and last point, I hope that the Trump administration will strongly support the incorporation of the e-commerce agreement into the WTO legal architecture. And more importantly, that it will participate in the next phase of negotiations when the time is right. As things stand now, we are already behind the curve. We are playing a game of catch up with the rapid pace of digital transformation. And we lack a common set of global digital trade rules. Hence, we must ensure that the agreement is implemented sooner rather than later, especially in the face of economic fragmentation. So I certainly hope that the Trump administration will return to the table, that it will adopt a pragmatic approach in the second phase of negotiations, which we hope to address issues such as data flows, data localization, and source code. Thank you. I'll end here.
Thank you, Ambassador Tan, and thank you for your ongoing leadership in Geneva. You've done a lot of the heavy lifting to advance these conversations on digital trade and the e-commerce moratorium and the JSI. And so really appreciate everything you've done and continue to do. And I'm sure we'll have some follow-up in a couple of minutes. Olivia, great to see you as well again, and thank you for taking some time out of running your business to be with us. Maybe take a moment to tell us about Arcascope, and if you could, maybe just tell us what a small business like yours needs from the Trump administration so that you can succeed globally.
Really happy to. Hi, I'm Olivia Walch. I'm a sleep doctor turned app maker. My company makes apps to help people manage shift work and get over jet lag. And I think that second one can kind of clue you into why I'm here. People who are jet lagged are usually in a different country from where they originated, which means global trade is part of what we do. Since connecting with folks like Jake, I've really learned how much the e-commerce moratorium matters to us. It's so important to us. It wasn't actually something that had occurred to me, being somebody coming from sleep tech, that for instance, digital goods crossing borders could be something that tariffs are applied to. And one of the reasons it was so incomprehensible to me is I think of digital goods as just fundamentally different than other goods. I mean, if I called a friend in India and I gave her advice on how to get over jet lag, I don't think anyone would say, oh, that's a digital good. But if I sent her a Zoom recording of me telling her that in a file, okay, well, that's a digital product. If instead of sending her a recording, I wrote it down, and instead of me making it, an AI made it. Well, I think we start to get more and more clearly a digital good, and yet it's the same thing crossing borders. It's information, and I think it kind of creates a distortion if one of those is okay and the other one has tariffs applied to it. So I think a big thing startups like me need is continuation of e-commerce moratorium. Another thing is, mentioned we're a small business. We're really small. I see my team of 8 in person 3 times a year, but on Zoom daily. We are really, really good at digital sleep and circadian algorithms, but we are not lawyers. I always say this when I'm on the phone with my lawyer, I'm counting every minute because we're very attentive to our runway and our capital. And you know who's really good at lawyers are big tech, Meta, Google. I don't have the bandwidth, the resources to deal with specific regulations in different countries. And so, well, we're not opposed to rules. We want our consistent rules across the board so we don't have to seek legal advice for how to operate in a specific nation. Or more likely, just stop operating in that nation. Because again, if we need to jump through a lot of legal hoops, like we'll probably do a cost benefit analysis and decide, well, people will just be jet lagged there because we don't have the resources to make sure we're compliant. Another sort of non-starter, besides like, oh, it's too complicated, these regulations, is sharing source code. I mean, like our secret sauce is our source code. And we have data collected from Americans spanning years and years that inform our machine learning models that we keep very secret. And if we had to disclose that to operate in a place, it just wouldn't be worth it. There's sweat and literally spit in those samples that we're using to train these models. No tears though, but they're very, very proprietary biospecimen samples that sharing source code would expose. So we just would not go there. And I'll close by saying a big thing that we hope for from the Trump administration is that they're going to remove barriers to data flows. Data flows foster innovation. I work with people all around the world. We're trying to not just fix shift work and jet lag, but also have people time their medicines so they're more effective. And bureaucracy getting in the way of that is not what we want. And so anything that can encourage data flows that will foster American innovation is something we're very much behind.
Olivia, thank you very much for sharing your story and sort of connecting the everyday work that you do back to some of these larger policy issues, right? I mean, some of the issues that you spoke about are captured in the great rules that the Trump administration wrote for the U.S. Mexico-Canada free trade agreements and the agreement with Japan. And so I think it's important to keep in mind the practical effect that policy has on businesses like yours. So thank you. Jason, I wanted to turn back to you maybe to dig in a little bit more on AI. And so, I think that race to win the global AI competition sort of adds some urgency to the need for global leadership. And, there's been a lot of discussion after the announcement of DeepSeek's platform about the future of U.S. global AI leadership. And so, could you talk a little bit more in the specific context of AI? How should the United States seek to lead and how can it go about doing that?
Yeah, I think you're right to characterize this as a race, Jake, and DeepSeek obviously got a lot of attention, and that attention was not just in DC, it was on Wall Street as well, about what that meant for future investment in AI in the US. And look, if we believe what DeepSeek said, which I don't necessarily, based on some of the initial announcements and some of the initial coverage, it's a pretty cool technology development. It may or may not have all the capabilities that it's been suggested it has, but there's no doubt that we're in a race in the US against China and other economies for AI leadership. And the one thing we can take away definitively from DeepSeek is that this is a race and that there are capabilities being launched around the world. And if the Trump administration wants the US to remain the leader in AI, it needs to make some very quick and very definitive policy decisions in a number of areas to include both the trade topic and the tariff topic that we've been talking about, but some other important digital trade areas of policy focus. So what we're really looking for the U.S. to do is engage, and a couple of early encouraging signs. One is OSTP, even though the new OSTP director, Michael Kratsios, hasn't been confirmed. The interim director is leading already and moving already and has issued a request as of last week for industry engagement and industry involvement and feedback on what the new roadmap for AI strategy for the Trump administration should be. Very encouraging to see that. And obviously, there's going to be a huge trade component to that. We're looking forward to filing comments there and participating in that discussion. Two, in the very waning days of the Biden administration, the so-called AI diffusion rule that was issued was not very well thought out, was not very well executed, and holds very real risk for U.S. AI domination globally, for the simple reason that it raises questions about the willingness of the U.S. to engage with partners around the world and make AI technology available around the world robustly in a way that protects national security, but also promises economic growth and development for U.S. AI investors. That decision was a poor decision made literally a week before the Biden administration left town. We have an opportunity there because the Trump administration has a comment period open for the next few months on that. So we have an opportunity to work with the administration to engage on that. That's a very important global AI leadership question around AI. And then again, as I said before, I think the hope that we have, the aspiration we hope that we hold for the Trump administration is for that kind of industry engagement, asking a lot of questions, informing policymakers. I'll be up on the Hill on Wednesday, snow permitting, testifying about AI and manufacturing and policies that the Hill can adopt there. It was great to hear Olivia talk about her app. Because it uses something called a digital twin, which creates a representation of my sleep patterns in the digital world. Digital twins are something that is used in manufacturing as well, very effectively with AI, to create a virtual rendering of an assembly line before actually constructing it, for example. So opportunities to inform Congress about that as well, I think, are really important. But AI leadership also requires, Jake, I'll just say this last, a sound analysis of national security interests that make sure that whatever tools are adopted to protect American security are narrowly tailored to that specific end. We see the harm that happens with our allies around the world if we don't do that correctly, as with the AI diffusion rule. The U.S. picked, seemingly at random, the Biden administration picked a number of countries around the world that can get access to U.S. compute power from technology companies and excluded other countries at random from that list. We expect and hope that the Trump administration will do a better job of determining where those national security threats actually exist so that we can work with our partners on a global stage to advance U.S. AI domination.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, as I recall, that line excluded a number of close U.S. allies and trading partners as well, right? And so, I think we share your concern there. I think, Ambassador Tan, we talked a little bit about this already, but as we said, the Trump administration helped launch the WTO Joint Statement Initiative, including on e-commerce. Could you talk a little bit about the mood in Geneva right now, and what do you see as kind of just expand on your earlier answer in terms of the role for the United States in advancing that shared digital trade agenda? Feel free to talk beyond Geneva if you would like as well.
Well, thank you, Jake, for that follow-up question. I have expressed my hopes on what I would like to see the Trump administration do in terms of engaging in digital trade issues. So let me just add 2 more points. The first point really is that American leadership is extremely important. The US has an extremely important role to play in shaping the shared digital trade agenda. And I think here the operative word is shared. It's a digital trade agenda that is shared by everybody. And the US has an extremely important role to play because it is the largest digital economy in the world. and in 2023 accounted for more than 15% of global digitally delivered services exports. The US is also home to the lion's share of tech giants, including Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, and Microsoft. And these giants drive the development of many frontier digital technologies. So what this means is that the US is deeply integrated into the global digital trade supply chain. So its actions and its non-actions, the choices that it makes, will shape the future of the shared digital trade agenda. Hence, I hope that industry players, including small companies like the one that Olivia runs, will continue to encourage the Trump administration to support efforts to accelerate the adoption of interoperable digital trade rules. And the key word here is interoperable. In this connection, I'm encouraged that since the text of the e-commerce agreement was published in July last year, many US businesses have expressed strong support and reaffirmed its value in establishing useful and meaningful e-commerce rules. And taking up the point that Olivia raised earlier, these rules are extremely important in providing predictability and certainty to businesses. The second point, concerning the shared digital trade agenda, is that the best arena for that to happen is the WTO. The WTO sits at the core of the rules-based multilateral trading system. And every one of its 166 members share the common responsibility of working together to advance a shared digital trade agenda. Just last week, I had the pleasure of moderating a fireside chat with President Santiago Pena of Paraguay. And among his many wise observations, the one that has stuck with me was his point that any crisis of multilateralism can only be solved by one thing: more multilateralism. So I hope that the US will continue to support the WTO, will continue to play an important role in strengthening the WTO and in shaping the shared digital trade agenda. I think I'll stop here.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador Tan. And you make a really good point about the U.S. needing to be at the table. We always say if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think that's true not only at the WTO, but, Jason, as you were talking about U.S. global AI leadership, that's at the G7, the G20, the OECD, all these forums where they are setting AI standards in addition to making new digital trade rules. So I think, we'll have to wait and see how the Trump administration decides to engage in all of those bodies. Kate, I want to turn to you next. So can this administration sort of walk and chew gum at the same time? The president personally has been very focused on goods and reshoring domestic manufacturing. Can he and they continue to do that while also leading on digital trade? And, I know we haven't really mentioned tariffs yet, but is there a risk that frictions over tariffs will complicate U.S. leadership on digital trade?
Yeah, thanks. I think first, I think I don't agree in a separation between manufacturing goals and digital trade because, increasingly manufacturing is digital and digital is manufacturing. I mean, we can't have strategic deployment in manufacturing growth in the sectors that President Trump has put his weight behind without advanced technological leadership. I mean, this is critical. And so I think they are interchangeably linked. Walk and chew gum at the same time. I mean, I think that they have to, and the dizzying amount of executive orders shows that they're prepared to walk and chew gum at the same time. One has to hope that our trading partners can do the same, right? Tariffs will create friction. We see that. I mean, every day there are more comments from trading partners from the White House that indicate that we are barreling towards some difficulty, shall we say, with trading partners. I mean, I think What I would say is that disagreements around certain approaches shouldn't mean that we can't work together when we want to or need to. And one hopes that friction over tariff policy won't cloud our ability to do that with our trading partners, because I agree with what others have said. It's really critical that we work together on these shared policy goals. And I think the things that sort of create a foundation of the president's goal on U.S. technological leadership mean that we'll have to depend on some of these very foundational things that we have talked about in the WTO and with our trading partners. No forced data localization, free flow of data, non-discriminatory treatment of digitally delivered goods and services. I mean, these are going to be critical components of not only U.S. technological leadership, but the digital economy globally. And I think, we haven't really spoken very much about China. It's sort of there in the background, but these are principles that we've lost a little bit, particularly with the pullback from the U.S. in the global discussions. And I think if we want to be successful in confronting the growth of China, we have to do it with our partners. So, I hope everyone can walk and chew gum at the same time. We're going to have to get through some challenging conversations, but I think it's in all of our best interest to do so.
Thanks, Kate. And I think, one thing that I noticed during the last administration was that there were these sort of headline-grabbing issues that the president talked about frequently, and tariffs certainly among them. But then there was sort of this workmanlike progress that was made on a continuous basis on digital trade. And I think during that first Trump administration, it resulted in a number of either good outcomes or progress being made on things like the WTO e-commerce moratorium. And so, that could be a way forward this time around as well. Olivia, could you talk a little bit about, what happens if the United States doesn't step up its leadership? What happens if the world continues to fracture, China continues to sort of barrel ahead, and, if we don't step up our game and kind of lead that global coalition?
Yeah, I think there's cut you off because I was so excited to talk about this. I think there's the like sort of straightforward bummer, which is that we limit our market, right? Like we don't operate in certain countries because either the rules are too much for us to manage, or there's forced source code disclosure, which we don't want to do. And so everyone gets a little bit more jet lagged, and we earn less money and we're less competitive. Longer timescale, especially for the sort of addressable, hey, this nation has specific rules, you need to put data localized there. I imagine third-party vendors will pop up, right? They'll recognize that this is a need, we have to operate, and we'll pay them for the service of making us compliant. But honestly, like I'd rather avoid that middleman, especially since it again, advantages big companies over small companies. The big companies who don't need to pay them or are better equipped to pay them get the edge, and small companies who just want to operate in that place, but now are paying an extra % on every dollar they bring in just to be compliant there. It adds up. I mean, like as a person who operates in Apple's App Store, you're talking a 30% cut on what you bring in for the services that they provide. And they do a lot of this sort of compliance stuff already for us, but I don't want to see that number go up any more than it has to.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Olivia, very much. Jason, I want to turn back to you. I mean, you talked about China and about national security. And so this is an area where, the last panel talked about the increasing importance of national security and economic security as well. And so, as you look forward in terms of U.S. leadership, that could be writing digital trade rules. It could be, engaging in multilateral forums, but it could also be, as you suggested, thinking about new export controls, national security rules, clean cloud networks out of the State Department, right? And so could you talk a little bit more about that, how the United States ought to lead in terms of balancing that national security component and economic competitiveness?
It's such an important question, and it's a tough one. And these issues are very complicated. And obviously, the U.S. government has a primary responsibility to protect the national security interests of the country. So these issues are not insignificant. At the same time, we can do this in a way that balances those legitimate national security interests with the economic goals that we've been talking about all day. I mean, the goal of trade at the end of the day is to provide US companies access to the 95% of the world that doesn't live in the United States. And a pretty significant percentage of those people, 1.4 billion of them or so, live in China. And so if we're going to manufacture in the US and we're going to produce in the US and we're going to innovate in the US, it makes no sense to deny US companies access to that massive market. And we can do this balancing act in a way that really recognizes the economic interests and the economic advantage of selling into China without implicating the national security interests. There's a big difference between selling products or services that advance the interests of the Chinese military and one that advances the interest of Chinese consumers. So that's the really, I think, the heart of the challenge. And again, I don't mean to minimize how challenging this is. We want to make sure that US companies, when they're manufacturing in particular, and the semiconductor industry is a great example of this, semiconductors manufactured in the US, that's fantastic. We want to encourage that. We're doing very well there. We're going to do better in the coming years. But we need to make sure those semiconductors can be sold where things are made. And a lot of things are made in China. And cutting off that market access to US manufactured semiconductors doesn't make any sense if there isn't a national security interest. So this balance has to be struck. And it's important in the physical world. It's important in the digital world as well, because we want AI to have access to international markets when it's created and innovated and manufactured digitally here in the US. And if there isn't a national security interest in preventing that from happening, we don't want to deny American companies those overseas markets that are so important.
Yes, the other thing thank you, Jason. I mean, the other thing that I would add is that the process matters too, and that we complained about it when the Trump administration put out orders without a comment period or the ability to talk about unintended consequences. We complained about it again when the Biden administration did the same thing. And so, what's really important, I think, both from the USTR perspective in terms of developing new digital trade rules, and certainly from a national security perspective, and what the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Commerce Department and others do is really making sure that you've got a process in place that takes into account and solicits the advice of stakeholders so that you have a better final product. Because otherwise you get at exactly the complaints that you had, Jason, about the Biden administration's rules that they developed as they were leaving town. Kate, anything that you wanted to add to that conversation?
Well, first, I have to agree with you completely about comment. I mean, we used to negotiate good regulatory practices, and the Administrative Procedures Act was the thing that we talked about. You can't make good policy without actually getting everybody's input. And you really want to try to avoid unnecessary trade friction when you don't have to. I think it's a really interesting question when we look at these sectors, which we've deemed to be critical to our national security. I mean, we're trying to build them from the bottom up in an environment where there is not fair competition. And so, you have to be really thoughtful about how you do that. Margins are incredibly tough. We have lots of extra costs in the US that we need to somehow figure out how to offset those. Maybe it's through subsidies, maybe it's through tariffs, but I do think we all can agree we have to be able to access buyers outside the United States. And we have to make sure that we're not creating, quote unquote, own goals by increasing tariff burdens that we could otherwise limit. So I do think these things can't operate in a vacuum. They have to be done with a very thoughtful notion of the entire supply chain, including the inputs, the customers, the developers, and all the rest. And so it does have to be regulated and promulgated in a thoughtful way.
Thank you, Kate. Ken, I see you back on. Over to you.
Hate to cut off a hot conversation about a super important topic, one that we're really glad, Jake, to partner with NFTC on looking at more at these issues. Jason, you're also a great partner. Mr. Ambassador, pleasure to see you again, and very grateful for you making the time this late in the evening in Geneva. And Olivia, pleasure to meet you. I have to look into your app and your company. Could certainly use a little bit of help, probably with my own sleep patterns these days, as I continually look at my phone to see what latest news is popping up. Probably not good for my health to be doing that either. Anyway, thank you all very much. Really appreciate your time. Looking forward to keeping this conversation going with all of you again in the months to come.